Welcome, good evening, and welcome to the first of the Nashua Historical Society's fall programs. My name is Alan Cohen, and we're delighted that you could be here. This evening, we are pleased to have Bob Goldsack with us. Bob is going to talk about the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War. Bob is going to briefly touch on the military and political events that led up to the conflict and the geopolitical results of the outcome. This is an abridged version of a 5-week course that Bob teaches in the RISE program at Riviera University. Bob has written 15 books on all manner of outdoor recreation and amusement, including books on circuses, amusement parks, fairs, carnivals, and Benson's Wild Animal Farm in Hudson. Bob lives in Nashua. I just had a momentary pause. Bob lives in Nashua. He's a graduate of Seton Hall University. He is a Navy combat veteran of the Korean War and a proud member of the Nashua Historical Society. Following Bob's presentation, we invite you all to join us for some refreshments in the kitchen area across the lobby. So please join me in welcoming Bob Goldsack.
Thank you very much, Alan. As Alan mentioned, I did a course at Riviera College, and it was 5 weeks, 7.5 hours all told. And I tried to condense that into 1 hour tonight. So if I'm still talking at 11 o'clock, you know, put up your hand and let me know, okay? All right. I'd like to start out with just something that kind of sums up everything about Korea. When we dedicated the memorial in Washington, D.C. back in 1995 on July 28th, this was the program. And I'd just like to read the front, which I think, as I say, sums up the story. Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. And that's very true about Korea. And before I get into more or less my talk, I'd like to start tonight's talk with a listing of facts about the Korean War. And so little is known about the war that I feel this is necessary because it has to start at the beginning of our discussion. The war started on June 25th, 1950, and ended on July 27th, 1953. That means it ran 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days. During those 3 years, 34,000 Americans were killed. In the beginning, the way they calculated the casualties from the war, in the very beginning, they took anyone who died for those 3 years, any place in the world, and they incorporated those, and that figure was well over 50,000, which I was astounded when I first saw that. Then they decided that they would only list the people who died in the combat zone. And unfortunately there too, it wasn't true because a lot of the people that died in the combat zone were not what we would call killed in action. For instance, we had a 17-year-old boy that washed overboard on our ship, and the weather was just too rough, and we couldn't rescue him. Our captain, we had a very bad collision, and our captain came back after the Navy looked into all the problems that we had, and he was told he would never have another command. So he jumped down the forward elevator pit, and that's all we knew about him. And of course, there were a lot of people who died from different diseases and everything else. But they finally got it down to the figure that I quoted of 34,000 that were actually killed in action in Korea. And it's kind of interesting, too, if you compare those figures with Vietnam, for instance. Vietnam lasted 10 years, and they had 54,000 killed in action. The Iraqi war lasted 10 years, and they had 5,500 killed. So you can see how intense the Korean War was in 3 years. Now, it's always been considered a ground war, and but very little is known and published about the big part played by the United States Navy and other UN countries. It was also not a civil war. Everyone thinks because it was North against South that it was a civil war, but it wasn't. It started out that way, but they were backed, and it ended up as a locally controlled war between China and the United States and members of the United Nations. 20 members of the United Nations participated in Korea, and you never really ever hear anything about that. They furnished fighting units, medical units, ships, and all kinds of help they could give. A very interesting part is that General MacArthur, you hear so much about General MacArthur being in charge and everything, and he reported only to the President of the United States, Harry Truman, even though he was in charge of 21 countries that were fighting under the UN banner. And, you know, most people would think, well, he would have to report to the UN Secretary General or the UN Secretary Council or someone with the UN, but he reported only to Harry Truman. Korea also, and I don't know whether we have any Marines here. Do we have any Marines? It was the first war that the Marine Corps ever had to draft men. And we'll get into that as we go along, why they had to draft men. And it was a war that really no one back here in America really cared about. They didn't pay much attention to it. Television hadn't really come into its own yet, so it wasn't like Vietnam where you had it every night on television and the news. So people just forgot about it. And many of the fighting men really didn't even know or understand why they were there and why they were fighting. It was poorly publicized. And again, after the war ended, we really didn't even realize or know, did we win, did we tie, did we lose? What's the story? We had no idea what we accomplished during the Korean War. And that's why it's so easy to be referred to as the Forgotten War. On the plus side, it was the first war where bodies were all brought back to the United States to be buried. In fact, we're still bringing bodies back that are being found. You know, during World War I and during World War II in Europe, the government set up cemeteries. I have an uncle that's buried in right near Bastogne. He was killed at the Battle of the Bulge. And, but this was the first war where everybody came back to the United States. It was also a war where MASH units came into being, and I'm sure everyone here has watched the MASH programs going way back. And the lives they were able to save is amazing when you think about how quick they were able to get the wounded and work on them almost a very short time after they were wounded. And then it was a war where the fighting men, when the war ended, they didn't come home. Those who were drafted had to serve out their draft times, which I think was, as I recall, 3 years for the Army. People, yes?
It was 2 years. 2 years.
2 years, okay. Like myself in the Navy, it was 4 years. And I was telling a couple people beforehand, I was in another war before I even came home from the Korean War, because my ship right after, in 1954, right after Korea ended, we took a load of planes up to Saigon, to the French, and they were getting whipped up at the Dien Bien Phu, and we had to go up the Saigon River, and during the Korean War, nobody actually ever shot at my ship. But going up to Saigon, we were at battle stations the whole way up, and we had French gunboats all around us, and every once in a while you hear ping, ping, and that meant they were shooting at us. So, but we got a lot of medals and ribbons for during Korea, but nobody ever mentioned us going up to Saigon to deliver the planes to the French, so I don't know whether the government didn't want that known to the public or what. Okay, I entered high school in the fall of 1945, just a few weeks after VJ Day. And the hardships of the Depression and World War II were then behind us. And our fathers, brothers, uncles, and neighbors had proven to the world that the United States was the most powerful country in the world. And we knew that there wouldn't be any more wars in our future. So for 4 years, it was football, basketball, baseball, student council, dances, plays, senior class president, some studying, and of course girls. TV didn't exist for most of us. And the only part of the newspaper I ever read was the sports section and the comics in those days. But a lot happened around the world while I was going to high school. And, but it didn't affect me, as it happened all a long way from Plainfield, New Jersey, which was my hometown. I found out later that the United States and Great Britain had beaten back communism, the spread of communism in Europe, by the Berlin airlift. I didn't know that in high school. It was later on that I found out about that. There was also great turmoil in the nation's capital. Congress had just cut the defense budget drastically. The newly formed U.S. Air Force, and do we have any Air Force men here? Okay, I don't want you to get mad at me, but the newly formed U.S. Air Force had a strong lobby and had Congress on the verge of eliminating the Marine Corps and the Navy Air. They felt there was no need for either one of them, and the Air Force could do high-level bombing from any place in the world. And that was what they based their whole thing on, was high-level bombing. They also claimed that all future wars would be fought deep in Europe, and also that there would be no need for any kind of invasion type of warfare as we did in the Pacific during World War II. They said, you know, they could take care of all of that. And they also claimed that there was no need for aircraft carriers, and had the Navy's newest carrier, which I think was called the United States, if I'm not mistaken, when the Secretary of Navy was out of town, they had it scrapped. And as soon as he returned to Washington and found out, he resigned his position as Secretary of the Navy. The Army also sided. Do we have any soldiers here? Okay. The Army also sided and claimed that we really didn't need a Navy except to shuttle men here and there and supplies. That's all we needed the Navy for. And there would be no need to invade any beaches or anything else. And the discussion was caused a lot of very hard feelings in the military. And they had all kinds of meetings with Congress and everything else. But thank goodness, Congress, as it always does, did nothing. And everything worked out fine. Meanwhile, Korea, following World War II, had been divided by the United Nations into actually two countries, North Korea and South Korea, and they were separated at the 38th parallel. And China was given the North, and the United States was given the South. And the idea was that both the China and the United States were to set up governments to get those two countries going again. And they were to establish everything and then get out of that country. Well, the United States, as it always does, did what it was told. Got out of South Korea after it set up a government. The Chinese, on the other hand, did not. They didn't withdraw their troops. They left munitions, tanks, aircraft, everything there for the North Koreans. Now, getting back to me, during my freshman year in college, I started to think about the world again. And I started to read what was happening in the world. And after I finished my freshman year in college, I heard the turmoil that was happening in a country most people had never heard of, named Korea. North Korea armed forces invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1950. I said June 25th. By the evening of June 25th, the North Korean army was only 17 miles from Seoul, the capital of South Korea. By the way, this is the capital of North Korea. And they had come over the line and were down here ready to take over Seoul.
When was the 38th parallel established as a dividing line?
Yeah, originally, back with the UN, after World War II.
Oh, right after World War II?
Yes,
Okay.
right.
Okay.
Okay, on June 26th, President Truman told General MacArthur that he was to defend South Korea. And he immediately declared Korea a police action. Now, the reason he called it a police action was that if he wanted to declare a war, he would have to go to Congress. And he knew that if Congress took it under advisement, it would be weeks, months before they came up with any kind of a decision. And he realized that by that time, the entire peninsula of Korea would be communist. So he called it, and Harry Truman was quite a guy, if anybody has ever studied him, and he called it a police action for that reason. And that's something that most people do not understand. Why was it called a police action? He then quickly authorized the Navy and the Air Force to support the ROK, which is the Republic of Korea troops. On June 28th, the United Nations joined in, and it was amazing, and I'll give you a list later, but 20 countries joined and helped us. And that's another thing that most people are not aware of, that we had 20 other countries with us in Korea. The South Korean army was in disarray. They were poorly trained. They really didn't know what they were doing. I think I might have mentioned when I taught at Riviera, I had this man call me the night before I started to teach the course, and he said, I was in the North Korean army. And I thought, oh my gosh, now he's going to be in my class tomorrow. And he said, but I defected and joined the South Korean army a year before the war started. And he said, you wouldn't, and then we got talking, and he said, you would not believe how bad the South Korean army was. They had no real training or anything else. They didn't know who was in charge. It was a real mess. So, and of course, the whole start of the war caught the United States military completely off guard. The 4 Army divisions stationed in Japan were very, very under strength, only partially equipped with tanks and artillery and in very poor condition for combat. The 5th Air Force, also stationed in Japan, gave the illusion of strength, but was also an illusion, lacking up-to-date aircraft and experienced pilots. The Navy was also well understaffed, as the 7th Fleet, which was the Pacific Fleet, consisted of only 1 aircraft carrier, the Valley Forge, 2 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 4 subs, a small amphibious squadron, and a limited number of support ships. These ships also were scattered all through the Pacific at Okinawa, Hong Kong, Japan, the Philippines, and they had all got the call, hey, let's join up real quick. However, unlike the other services, the Navy never stopped training. One sailor was said to in an interview, said, we never stopped training. We trained and drilled and trained and drilled all the time. And all the Marine numbers. Now, the Marines at the end of World War II totaled 400,000. When Korea broke out, they had 74,000. That's all they had. But thank goodness the Marines, as usual, always kept up their training. And did I ask if we had any Marines here? No Marines. Okay, that's unusual. All right. But by July 3rd, the Valley Forge, the carrier, and its planes were attacking the enemy in the north already. And but the North Koreans were moving so fast that the whole world figured we were not going to win that anything. We were going to lose. In fact, they figured that the Navy was alerted at that time that they might have to evacuate everybody from Busan, which is right here. And I might double talk myself here, but by this time, the North Koreans had pushed themselves all the way down to what became the Busan Perimeter. And I drew this map, and I'm not an artist, as you can tell, and nothing is, exact. But this is all that was left of the fighting, free fighting forces at that point.
Was the government of Korea in that area?
Pardon?
Was the government of South Korea in that area? Did they move from?
Oh, yes, yeah.
What's the terrain in general in South Korea? Is it jungle, mountains, desert, or
Pretty desolate, very desolate, very desolate.
mountains?
Well, mountains are more in the north. Yeah.
Thinly occupied.
Immediately, the Air Force began shuttling men from Japan. And on July 5th, they delivered 508 men from the 24th Division, carrying a limited round of ammunition and 2 days' rations. They were trying to hold back 5,000 well-trained communist troops. Half the rifles and field radios didn't work. Firing pins were missing from their machine guns, and ammunition was in short supply. Rounds from their bazookas just bounced off the Russian tanks, the Russian-built tanks. For the first 40 days, it was a handful of men against an army. At that point, the American army was incapable of stopping a much lower power in a conventional war. The only, and I mentioned the perimeter, so I won't go back over that. Never publicized or recognized, the Navy scrapped together a batch of old ships that were left in Japan. They were left to the Japanese government for just getting their economy going and moving stuff from island to island. As you know, Japan is a series of islands. And we told the Japanese we need these ships immediately back. And we had them operating a very short period of time and landed the first Calvary. And here again, here is Busan and Pohang, and this is where that first landing took place. Now, before the landing took place, there were many days had to be spent clearing mines from that area. And that was quite a job of clearing the mines before we could land the troops. But in a very short period of time, they landed the first Calvary with 10,000 troops, 2,000 vehicles, and some 2,729 tons of cargo. Prior to the landing, I already mentioned the mines, and this effort preserved the perilous toehold still held by United Forces, UN forces. Next delivered were the 5th Marines, the Army's 2nd Infantry Division, and the 5th Regimental Combat Team. Who said World War II type invasions would never be necessary again? During this time, high-level officers of the Air Force were causing all types of problems with the use of air power. Most of the Air Force planes were flying from Japan and could only be over their targets for short periods of time due to the lack of fuel. Air Force officers never understood or tried to understand the cooperation between ground forces and pilots that was perfected by the Navy and Marine Corps in their island hopping during World War II. Marine and Navy pilots could be called to drop bombs, rockets, and napalm just a few yards short of their ground pounders. They would call up and say, we need napalm, or we need rockets, or we need so-and-so, and we need it 10 yards, 20 yards ahead of where you see where we are. And those Navy pilots and Marine pilots could go down and do that. We call that down and dirty. Now this caused considerable friction, and the generals and the admirals, they had quite a battle, and finally the Navy was allowed to more or less run its own operation when it came to aviation. Bickering went back and forth between the two services, but okay, I already mentioned that. The Navy was extremely short of personnel because now we had a war and ships were coming out of mothballs like you wouldn't believe. In fact, before the end of the war, we had almost 500 Navy ships working in Korea. And the answer was we couldn't get enough men trained quick enough. So what we had to do is call all the reserves back in. And most of these men were guys that had fought in World War II and had got out of the service and went on to college on the GI Bill. They joined the reserves, not really for patriotic, but as a part-time job to get extra money. And all of a sudden, they were all called back. And this was the Navy and the Marines. And the Army, they called back many National Guard units. When I first went aboard ship, and I had gone through 14 weeks of boot camp, and then 8 weeks of Navy air training, and then 12 more weeks of Navy aviation supply. And so when I went aboard ship after all that, I was ready to go to Korea and win the war myself. I was really gung-ho. I went aboard ship and I couldn't believe the attitude of these guys. They didn't like the Navy. They hated the Navy. They weren't Navy-type people. I just couldn't believe how they were until I was aboard about 3 days, and a person got me aside and he said, these guys were called back, or many of them had already put in 4 years in the service and were frozen, and they're now in their 5th year and they still don't know when they're ever going to get home. And it was a rough time. And in fact, in the first part of the war, the reserves fought, that took most of the fighting. I had a personal friend that he fought through a couple of islands in World War II, and then he went to college, became a lieutenant, and boom, he was back in Korea. He was back in the Marines and in Korea fighting again. And this happened to so many. Has anyone ever seen the movie The Bridges of Toko-Ray? If you have, that'll give you a real good idea of how Mr. Brubacher, I think was his name in the movie, if I'm not mistaken, he had been all through World War II and then was called back in Korea, and he was a lawyer and was building up a nice clientele and everything, and he got called back, and it tells how this affected his family and everything else until he was finally shot down and killed in Korea. We all know the story. Ted Williams, Jerry Coleman of the Yankees, many ball players. And here's one that I didn't know until I started to read, but does anyone remember Eddie LeBaron? Eddie was the quarterback for the Washington Redskins, yeah. And he was he was wounded twice in the legs and received 2 Purple Hearts and came back and still played football when he got home. But all these fellas gave up their jobs and everything else to go fight. And the Marines, when they called up their reserves, a lot of their guys had just joined. They hadn't even gone to boot camp when they were called up. And the story goes that in one whole group going over to Korea, they learned how to clean their rifles and how to shoot their rifles from the fantail of the ship because they hadn't had any training, but they were called up and they had never fired a rifle. And so they had to go through all of this in 14 days before they got to Korea. And those guys earned the title of Minutemen of the 1950s. Navy Commander Malcolm Cagle and Frank Manson wrote a book about the Sea War in Korea. And they said, U.S. Navy ships and ships from 7 other United Nations members, plus the Republic of Korea, were destined to fight a bitter, unglamorous, and seemingly futile war among the coastlines of Korea. Many ships were hit and an unlucky few were sunk. Their work would go largely untold and unrewarded. General MacArthur was not happy with the type of war. He kept wanting an atomic war. And of course that led to his being fired by Harry Truman later on. Despite the fact that the Army and Air Force said that invasions would no longer be necessary in future wars, General MacArthur had this great idea about landing, having a landing in Incheon. And guess who he chose? He chose the Marines to go in first and chose the Navy to set the whole thing up. And there's many stories, and I know I don't have time, but many stories of heroes who went in before the invasion and did a lot of work behind the lines before the invasion took place, because Incheon was a very tough harbor, and only 2 days out of the month could landing ships go in and come out on the same tide. And what happened was when they went in, they had to stay land-bound overnight, and the Marines would unload them and everything else, and then they would have to leave the next day when the tide came in. But one Navy lieutenant said his ship was, I want to read it now because it was in stinking condition and overrun with rats bigger than footballs. And he had only a very short time to clean that up, and a few days later he was guiding his ship through the channels into Incheon for the invasion. At the same time, the Navy aircraft carriers were softening up the area. And it's very interesting that General MacArthur, the general of the Army, planned the invasion using the Navy and Marines for the job. MacArthur told the press on the morning of September 15th, 1950, "The Navy and Marines have never shone more brightly than this morning." Now, the idea behind MacArthur's invasion was the 8th Army came in here, was landed. This over here, the Army had pushed up here and the Marines were landed. And the idea was that the 8th Army would move up here, the Army would move up this way, and I don't think I drew this exactly right, but the Marines would go up what is called the spine of Korea, which was all mountains. And they would go up in here. What happened was a trap was set for the Marines. As the Marine headed up the only road north, Marine Major General Oliver Smith was not happy with the orders given to him by General Almond, who was higher in rank and was in charge of the whole operation, and he was an Army general. General Smith worried about reports from pilots claiming that the Chinese troops were crossing the Ula River, and thousands of footprints could be seen in the snow. And they kept reporting this to General MacArthur's headquarters. And the people in General MacArthur's headquarters kept saying, no, there's no Chinese around, no problem. Don't worry about the Chinese. They're not going to get involved. And on November 25th, 1950, as the temperature fell below the 0 mark, the Marines reached the furthest most point of their advance. 2 days later, 60,000 to 100,000 Chinese in wave after wave attacked the Marines. And Marines were outnumbered 10 to 1. They fought back the attack after killing many thousands of Chinese, but also suffering very heavy losses themselves. The press called it a retreat. And because what they had to do, I keep forgetting, I've got to get over here for the camera. What they had to do is they were up here by the Chosin Reservoir, and they had to come all the way back down to Ham Hung here. And that's where the ships were waiting to evacuate them. The press called it a retreat, but in typical Marine fashion, the Marine officers, in fact, the press called it, they anticipated that it would be the worst defeat the U.S. has ever suffered. And the Marine, in typical Marine jargon, said, we're not retreating, we're just attacking in a different direction. And another Marine officer said, when you're surrounded, the only way out is to advance. And flesh stuck to metal, and weapons and rations and water froze in the canteens. M43 jackets weren't able to keep the men warm from the freezing climate and constant snow. Hazardous road, deep cliffs on one side, and you have to see some pictures to see how deep these cliffs were. And this was all slippery going, and trucks would just slip right over the side and crash down. And on the other side were the mountains, and in the mountains were the Chinese popping down at the Marines. And the men, they had to buddy up because they couldn't sleep more than a half hour. It was felt that if they slept more than a half hour, they would freeze to death. So they would sleep back to back, and one guy would go to sleep, and then the other guy would stay awake, and then he would wake him up, and that's the way they had to go. I don't know whether anyone's ever heard of Colonel Chesty Puller, but he was a big, big hero and really pushed those Marines all the way back to Ham Hung. And the Navy and Marine cuirassiers from nearby carriers, weather permitting, were able to help and get down in those mountains, and as I say, what we call down dirty. But the pilots had to be aware that they couldn't use up their fuel, because if they had a ditch in the water off Korea at that time of year, they would freeze to death in 6 minutes. So the pilots had to be very careful and watch their fuel consumption. Navy corpsmen were extremely busy with the wounded because, you know, the Marines don't have their own medics, so the Navy corpsmen take care of that. For 17 days, the Marines fought their way back. And each one of these places, they would rest for a little while and come back and end up in Ham Hung, where the Navy was waiting for them. And as the weary and tired Marines entered it's Hung Ham. Not Ham Hung, it's Hung Ham. I'm glad my Korean friend isn't here. He'd be correcting me. As they entered, before getting on the ships, they formed up, got their rifles, and sung the Marine hymn as they marched in. And a Navy officer who was standing right there was quoted, and please excuse the language, because we're talking in the military now. That Navy said, "Look at those poor bastards, those wonderful poor bastards." They had worn the same clothing and wet boots for 17 days and were absolutely filthy. They stunk. They actually stunk. But not only did the living return, but piled high on the beds of their jeeps and trucks and tanks and other vehicles were all the bodies of their buddies that were killed. 1,800 Americans lost their lives between here and here in 17 days. However, behind them, the landscape was just littered with dead Chinese. Now, it was a full-scale war. It wasn't North against South. It was the Chinese against the United States and the United Nations. In fact, up in Big Alley, United States pilots were fighting Russian pilots and Chinese pilots. In studying the war, it's very easy to come to the conclusion that it was of two parts. The first part was from June 25th, 1950, that's when the war started, to early 1951. It was a time of the heavy fighting and involved retreats, advances, mine clearing, saving the Busan Perimeter, Navy and Marine aircraft carrier operations supporting ground troops, the Incheon invasion, entering North Korea, breakouts, debarkations, Chinese entering the conflict, and the Chosin Reservoir. From the standpoint of casualties, 54% of the 34,000 men killed took place in those 8 months. 54%. Now, as I promised earlier, the United Nations, and this is very interesting. I was so surprised myself when I found out a few. I mean, I knew many of them, but Great Britain sent 14,000 some odd troops. Canada sent 6,000 some odd troops. New Zealand sent 1,300 and some odd troops. Australia, 2,282. Turkey, 5,455. Greece, 1,262. The Philippines, 1,400 and some odd. Thailand, 1,294. Ethiopia, 1,271. France, 1,119. Colombia, 1,068. Belgium, Luxembourg, 944. Republic of South Africa, 826. And the Netherlands, 819. I mentioned a Turkey unit. I have another good buddy who is from my original town in New Jersey, but he lives up here in Nashua now also. And he was a Marine. And he said his Marine unit got credit for taking a lot more prisoners than they should have. But the reason they did is that the Turks did not take any prisoners. And when the Chinese were smart enough to know if they had to surrender, they would surrender to the Marines. They would not want to surrender to the Turks. And he said, we got a lot of credit that we really didn't deserve. India, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Italy furnished medical units. A fierce battle in mid-February 1951 took place in the town of Chipyong. Although surrounded, U.S. forces held on as the Air Force dropped supplies and ammunition until the 5th Cavalry broke through. At that point, the communist offensive ran out of steam and U.S. troops crossed into North Korean territory. In April, the Chinese began a full fury attack and what became known as the last major assault by communist forces in Korea. This occurred in late May 1950. The Chinese lost 10,000 men at that time, and it was a 4-day battle. The last 2 years of the war settled into a World War I type of battle. It was a series of winning hills, mountains, valleys, losing some, and then regaining them. There were heavy artillery duels in those days. Many of the mountains had become a series of tunnels and bunkers where UN soldiers either froze or baked, depending on the type of year, as they mostly slept during the day and fought fierce fighting at night. You may have heard some of these battles: Heartbreak Ridge, Old Baldy, Bloody Ridge, Pork Chop Hill. Pork Chop Hill, they won, they lost, they won, they lost, it was back and forth. T-Bone, and hundreds of hills numbered they were named by their elevations. And in good old GI, typical GI fashion, there were twin peaks that they were fighting at, which they named Jane Russell. Meanwhile, the Navy was providing gunfire and fighting mines along both coasts. And the battleships, we had activated 4 battleships by that time: New Jersey, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Missouri. And they were used, a very unusual thing, they were used as artillery by many of the ground troops because they could come in close to the land, fire their 16-inch guns that would travel 15 miles inland. And the ground pounders could call, hey, we need some support here, and those ships could do that. And the cruisers could do the same thing, and of course even destroyers, but they couldn't go, shoot as far. On June 12, 1951, the destroyer Walk hit a mine during combat operations and lost 26 sailors. Several destroyers and a number of minesweepers were lost along with many lives. And mines was a big thing. The North Koreans, Chinese didn't really have any navy to fight us with, but they had mines, and they had thousands of them. And what they would do is they would float them down the Sea of Japan and down the Yellow Sea. And I always remember one time we were going along, they thought we spotted a mine. So the captain took our whole ship and turned it sideways because all along the catwalks were gun tubs for 40 millimeter, twin 40 millimeters. And they're those guns you see in any war, Navy war, where the boom, 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 like that. They're basically an anti-aircraft gun, but you could shoot them down. We shot at this thing for 20 minutes, couldn't hit it. And finally the captain says, all right, ship's landing party, report to the motor whaleboat. And they took off, and they came back, and they were all laughing because it wasn't a mine, but the Japanese fishermen have these big colored balls, glass balls that they attach to their nets, and that keeps the nets floating. And that's what we were shooting at, one that got loose. And, we took a lot of kidding when other people heard about it. To those in the bunkers, manning warships or flying sorties, the daily threat of death or dismemberment provided little prospect of compensation, glory, or even respect back in the United States. At that point, America really didn't care. They just didn't care. And I remember one time we came into the States, we docked, and about a half a dozen of us stopped at a bar right outside the base for a beer. And the bartender says, "Hey, where you guys been?" And we said, "Korea." And he said, "Oh, that thing's still going on?" And we had one guy, Jim Seneca, and he could be a hothead, and we had to hold him down. And somebody said, "Pay for your drinks and let's get out of here." And we did, and we never went back to that bar again, I'll tell you. But that was the feeling back home. Nobody really cared. They didn't know what was going on. And one of the most demoralizing factors was back in the United States. United States Steel and other steel companies went on strike. And they produced the steel that was made for munitions. And many of the soldiers up on the front lines got to such a point that they had to sign out for their ammunition and give a good explanation of how they used the ammunition that they had used. And there was a real shortage, but all of that was not United States Steel fault either, because the generals were directing half of all the military supplies that came off production lines to Europe, because they still believed there was going to be a war in Europe. And it was a tough time, I'll tell you. Many of the soldiers were also unhappy fighting for not only the United States, but for Syngman Rhee, who was the president or whatever of South Korea. He had turned himself into a dictator, and these soldiers were aware of how his troops treated South Koreans, their own people. And it wasn't a pretty sight. And unfortunately, it took a few years before Rhee was knocked down and out of power. He was finally disposed several years after the war ended. But the real victims of the war were the Korean people themselves. Over 3 million civilians were killed. It was also estimated that 500,000 North Koreans and 900,000 Chinese paid the price. All through the war, South Korean civilians just wandered around the country. They had lost their homes, had nowhere to go. It was really a sad story. And the unfortunate part was that in wandering, they crowded the roads and blocked the roads that were necessary for the military, the tanks, the trucks, the guys marching. There always seemed to be civilians blocking them. And anyway, the fighting ended at 10 a.m. on July 27th, 1953. again, Sigmund Rhee accepted the peace, but would not sign the armistice, much to the frustration of of American and UN countries. It was, in fact, today we still don't have a truce. What happened was, at the end of my sophomore year in college, I decided I was going to enlist, so I did. And how am I doing on time?
It's probably time to start getting close to wrapping up.
Start wrapping it up? Okay, all right. When we got out of aviation supply school, we could pick our ships on how you came out, your standing in class. And I wasn't the brightest, naturally, but I decided, there were like, I think 3 of the big carriers that were available, the Oriskany, the Princeton, and I don't know, one other. And, but they were taken real quick. And I didn't want any land ships. I joined the Navy to participate in the war. And so I picked a carrier based out of Alameda, California, and I thought, okay, that's what I need. I knew nothing about it. And I ended up on what was called the Sitco Bay. It was a CVE 86. And it was what they called a Kaiser coffin. Henry Kaiser got a okay to build 50 of these ships during World War II, and they were only supposed to last until the end of World War II. And he took many shortcuts. For instance, in the whole carrier, there were only 3 watertight compartments. So at the Battle of Okinawa, I think 6 of these ships went down right away. This is I brought a picture in just so you can see, and it looks big, but it isn't very big. 2.5 of these would be the flight deck for like the Bonhomme Richard or one of the other big carriers.
What are called jeep carriers?
They were called, originally they were called escort carriers because they were really built to convoy ships going to Europe because the destroyers weren't doing as good a job and they figured air power could help. Then they became jeep carriers. And we used to take a lot of kidding. We'd pull into a port or go by one of the big boys or rendezvous with them. First thing they would yell down to us, "What's she going to be when she grows up?" And you know, we had to take all that kind of stuff. But anyway, we had lots of problems with those carriers. And we did our job, but we had a very bad collision at sea. We had a fire at sea. As I told you earlier, we had one of our shipmates washed over. We couldn't retrieve them. We rode out a typhoon. Every time we had a fire, our 5-inch gun on the fantail, the laundry didn't work for 2 days. So, it was just unbelievable, the ship. In fact, as soon as the war was over, we came back to the United States. We made one more trip, which I think I already mentioned about going to Vietnam, and came back to the United States, and we deactivated it. It was sold for scrap within 3 years. It was just so badly damaged. But I think one very interesting thing, and this has really nothing to do with the war, except I was walking along the street in San Francisco, and I was in uniform, and I had all my ribbons on, and two big black limousines pulled up. I was going by a door that led into the Mark Hopkins Hotel, but not one of the main doors. And all of a sudden I looked, and there's the president's flag is on the one limousine. And the first limousine, 4 guys got out, and they obviously were his Secret Service. And out of the second one, he got out with one other guy. Now, I mean, this is 1950s, but he only had 5 Secret Service men with him. And he got out, and a couple of ladies saw him at the same time I did, and they came running up to him saying, "Oh, Harry," oh, and by the way, he was on his, he was going to be out of office very shortly afterwards. And the lady said, "Oh, Harry, we're going to miss you." And he says, "Oh, ladies, I'm going to miss you too." And I went up and I went to shake his hand, and he stood back and he said, "No, the President of the United States salutes you." And there's one of the nice moments of my life. Let's see. Oh, then what happened was, you know, as I said, we didn't go home right away. It was a year like before I got home. When the war was over, I got home because I hadn't been home in 13 months. And I got married and brought my wife out to the coast with me. And I said, you know, they'll never send me to sea again. Famous last words. I was aboard a sister carrier. And, but anyway, what we learned is that as the Air Force had stopped communism in Europe, we had stopped communism in Asia, the spread of communism. And that made us all feel much better of what we had done and what we had accomplished in Korea. Every time we meet Koreans, and I remember when we went down for the dedication of the memorial in Washington, after all the speeches were over, the Koreans had sent a big military gathering over. They came up and shook every one of our hands and said, "Thanks for saving our country." And they still do that. I was just down in Washington. You guys were there, right? And when we went in, and this was on Saturday, they first we had to go through a narrow, well, it was very complicated. We had to go through like because the president was going to be there, we had to go through like we were going through an airport and get on other buses and everything else to get there. But anyway, as you walked through and you entered, they had all these very nice, pretty girls, Korean girls. And the lady would say, "You go there, you go there, you go there." And you would go and you would turn around and they would put this medal around your neck. And then you would turn around and again they would shake your hand and say, "Thanks for saving our country." And it's kind of interesting, this medal we received. In the middle here, this is part of the fence that separates North and South Korea to this day. And we also got a medal from the New Hampshire group of South Koreans who gave us a luncheon the week before. And and I guess I don't want to go in anymore because my time is quite limited. And I think I'll stop right there. And I don't know, do I have time for a question or two? Or?
Maybe just a couple,
Okay.
if anybody wants
response, we'll just give you the microphone so you can have a question.
Truman just had recently integrated the services. Were there any black people on your ship?
Okay, I'll tell you that. That's another story. He integrated them back in 1947. We did not have, on my ship, we did not have one black Puerto Rican or Filipino in any place other than commissary, waiting on the officers, cleaning the officers' cabins, laundry, and barbers. They were in none of the other ratings aboard my ship. In 1952, a rumor came about that we were going to get a black bosun's mate. And we had a lot of, aboard my ship, we had roughly 400 men on my ship. And I'd say probably at least 200 at least were from the South. And boy, the rumors that went around and what was going to happen to him. And we were all ready for it. We knew what we had to do if we got into a problem. And sure enough, this guy came aboard, but boy, he knew what he was doing, and he had spent, and behind his back, we used to call him the Sitco's Jackie Robinson, because he took over and had those guys right in line and no problems. Yes. Oh.
One more, please.
Yeah, you mentioned Incheon Harbor. Incheon Harbor,
Yeah.
and I didn't know the real reason that you could bring the ships in only 2 days a month.
Yeah.
Because when we went in from Japan on the ships, we went in LSTs. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yep.
That's how they brought us in. Then the front end opened up and we jumped out and went where we had to.
Yeah.
But I
Well,
didn't
see-
know it was only 2 days a week.
Well, and I should have qualified that a little bit. Most of the landing craft had to go in and get out. Yeah.
Yeah, but the
There were like M boats. M boats could go in without any problem. Those. Yeah.
But at the Incheon, you had the wood, you had a barrier there. At Incheon, you had a barrier there. You had to use ladders to go up in the invasion.
right.
It wasn't a sand invasion. They dropped the troops off, then they had to climb the ladders and go in.
Yeah. But a couple of the LSTs had to remain there overnight.
Yeah,
on that
that's true.
bar.
That's how the
Yes.
troops got in. Yeah.
Could I ask if there are any other questions that maybe that Bob will answer them afterwards? We are running late. I know that Dick Mushishin wanted to say a word about the local group of Korean veterans here, quickly.
Yeah, I thank you very much for the Nashua Historical Society and Bob for the presentation. I'm a senior vice commander for the New Hampshire Korean War Veterans Association. We have the commander over here, and I'd just like to invite you, if you're not members, to go to the website nhkwva.org, and you can find applications if you like, and we're part of the national program also. One interesting thing about we're trying to get new membership, we're only 2 years in operation. We have about 80 members, 30 of which are Hillsborough County. But there are approximately 13,000 Korean servicemen, Korean service veterans in the state of New Hampshire, which is an unusual amount of people. But we just don't know how to reach them. So we try to take venues like this, thanks to the National Historical Society, and take advantage of that. So if you are interested, it's nhkwva.org on the website, and there's application forms there. It's very reasonable. It's only $10 a year, and we don't do bake sales or anything like that. We visit situations like this and try to let people have a presence in the community and do things for the veterans. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellen.
Sure. Well, Bob, are you still teaching at Rise? Are you still going to? Are you going to teach this class again at Rise?
Yeah, probably next year.
Okay,
Yes.
great. I can see why. I think we're all spellbound for the time that we spent with you, and I wish that we had more time this evening. And I hope that that you'll be able to stay around for a few minutes afterwards, because my guess is that people want to talk to you. So, Bob, on behalf of the Nashua Historical Society, of which you're a proud member, thank you very much for the presentation this evening. So.
Thank you.